my chapter, The Difference Between 0 and 1, Voices from the Tokyo Anti-Olympic Movements, already points to an important quote from some of the activists I interviewed for this text. They stressed that even if anti-Olympic critics were very few and hardly visible in Japanese mainstream media, it was very important to keep up the resistance, even if they were not successful in stopping Tokyo 2020. It was the difference between 0 and 1 that counted. Anti-Olympic protests do not draw very large crowds in Tokyo or Japan, but they do exist, and they do hold public protest events at least once a month. They organize lectures and publish reports and books. I argue that the anti-Olympic movements are mostly sustained by veteran activists from various social movements who have come together to fight Tokyo 2020. For them, the Olympics highlight most of the problems and contradictions in Japanese society. So depending on their respective activist socialization, they focus on specific issues surrounding the Olympics. Among these issues are spiraling costs and corruption scandals, the exploitation of workers, fears of increased securitization, and the ongoing Fukushima nuclear crisis. City redevelopment is another central concern. Processes of gentrification and displacement are contested by anti-Olympic movements around the world. In Tokyo, homeless communities living in nearby parks have been driven away, and public housing has been demolished to make way for new Olympic structures. When it comes to the role of Olympic sports, nationalism, commercialization, and the exploitation of athletes are further critical points raised. The anti-Olympic critics highlight a number of problems in Japanese society, from inequality, homelessness, and exploitation, to the privatization of public spaces, securitization, and nationalism. As the Tokyo Olympics are bringing together activists from different but connected social movements, this issue also sheds a light on the situation of social movements in Japan in general. In contrast to their rather low visibility today, social and political movements have a considerable history in Japan. In post-war times, most notably the mass demonstrations against the security treaty with the United States in the 1960s and 70s, and the fierce student revolts around the global moment of 1968. In the following decades, however, social activism has become something rather suspicious for many people. Most of today's anti-Olympic activists identify as the generation that was politicized on campuses in the 1970s. Not many younger people participate. It was only after the triple disaster of March 2011 that a considerable revival of movement mobilizations and anti-nuclear protests took place. And there are close connections between anti-nuclear and anti-Olympic movements. They criticize the slogan of Tokyo 2020 as Recovery Olympics and argue that rather than helping recovery, the Olympics are actually hindering recovery now, as they are channeling money, labor, and other resources towards the Olympics and towards Tokyo, away from the disaster-stricken Tohoku region, or more recently from people and businesses affected by the COVID-19 crisis. When the first rumors about possible impacts of the novel coronavirus pandemic on the Tokyo Olympics appeared in the media, it was just around the iconic date of February 28, 2020, exactly 147 days before the planned start of the Olympics in July 2020. This date was iconic because in the famous 1988 movie Akira, set in a dystopian 2019, there is a scene where we see a dilapidated signboard counting down the days until the Tokyo Olympics, not too different from the ones that can be seen all around the city these days. But this countdown has stopped right at 147 days, with a graffiti on the wall next to it saying, "Chushi da, chushi," just cancel it. Since then, this has become a main slogan of today's movements against the Tokyo Olympics. And of course, they continue to say Tokyo should resign and give up hosting the Games. The current postponement for them is the worst option because it will cost considerable additional amounts of public funds. And at the same time, the burden for residents and especially marginalized groups such as homeless people will be continued for at least one more year. Interestingly, the Games have become an issue in the July 2020 Tokyo gubernatorial election campaigns, with opposition candidates Yamamoto Taro and Utsunomiya Kenji now asking for the Olympics to be either cancelled or pushed back even further. Of course, anti-Olympic activists continue their protest activities and intend to do so even after the Olympics might be over next year. In contrast to their marginalization inside Japan, they have become part of a growing global movement. And as their transnational network is getting stronger, activists from past and future host cities used to visit and join each other's campaigns across the globe. Therefore, the goal is not only to stop the Games in Japan. The common goal is now no Olympics anywhere.